Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Hope all is well. So, our topic for this week will be unemployment and inflation. So, let's get to it. So, let's start with inflation. What is inflation? I'm sure you'd have heard the term at some point. All right, it's always in the news, people always talking about it. The government doesn't want it, and for good reason too. So, what is inflation? Inflation occurs when there is a sustained increase in the general price level over a given period. Okay, so when people talk about inflation, they're usually talking about prices rising. Okay, the opposite of inflation, of course, is deflation. So a sustained reduction in the general price level. What causes inflation? Some possible causes of inflation are too much demand in the economy, right? So when there's too much demand, there's too much money chasing too few goods, then suppliers and producers will be likely to increase prices because they can. Cost push inflation, right? So this occurs when the prices of raw materials, of inputs, of wages into the product goes up. Of course, suppliers and producers will have no choice but to put their prices up as well. Excess money supply growth. This occurs when there's too much money, sort of like too much demand in the economy, but this occurs when there is more of too much currency, so too much liquid paper. Say the government prints too much money, and then because there's too much money, the value of the money goes down. Everyone has notes and they're trying to get commodities. Once again, suppliers, producers or will be inclined to turn up their prices. So what does inflation do and why don't we like inflation? Inflation raises the cost of living and reduces the purchasing power of a currency within its economy. If prices are rising in the UK, then £1 will not be able to buy as much as it did before the price increase. Okay? So, let's say for instance in the US an apple is $1. Okay? And now say the apple costs $2, right? There's been inflation, okay? We don't want this because our money will now be what less than it was before. And this is why inflation is not usually a good thing. Some inflation, some targeted inflation might be good because it will signal to producers that the commodity is profitable and then they should supply it. So some targeted inflation may be usually between 1% to 2%. Okay, some would even go lower than that, might be permitted, but anything above say 4.5% and then we go higher and into double digits is usually frowned upon. Right, so there are three types of inflation we should be aware of. The first one is demand pull inflation. Okay, um, this occurs just like in the previous slide when there's too much demand in the economy. Okay, so there's too much demand, consumers are demanding for products, and so suppliers can afford to increase their prices. So if demand is growing faster than supply, then this will pull prices up, leading to demand pull inflation. Okay, so this is something we should be aware of. Second type of inflation is called cost push inflation. So this type of inflation is caused by costs increasing. For example, higher wages, higher import prices, monopoly suppliers pushing their prices up, higher materials, higher raw materials prices. All of this would push the cost of production higher. And then the other type, the third and final type of inflation, is when you have an interaction of both demand pull and cost push inflation. So when both demand is pulling inflation up and cost is pushing inflation up, both of these can cause inflation as well. Okay, so this is what demand pull inflation looks like. All right, so we have our aggregate supply curve, right? And we have our aggregate demand curve. Okay, now our aggregate demand increases, from aggregate demand 1 to aggregate demand 2. So we have this new aggregate demand curve. Of course, this is our new equilibrium, and you can see prices are higher, and so is quantity. This, on the other hand, is what cost push inflation looks like. Once again, we have our aggregate supply curve, have our aggregate demand curve, and this used to be our equilibrium, and now because cost of raw materials or whatever inputs we're using in production has gone up, of course supply is going to reduce, move to the left, okay, and then this will be our new price, higher than our previous price. This is our new quantity, that's our new equilibrium, and you see the prices have gone up. Finally, this is the interaction of both demand pull inflation and cost push inflation. Okay, so we have our supply and demand both rising. Okay, so cost is pushing prices up, demand is also pulling prices up, and this will keep happening and keep happening, and you can see price keeps going up. All right, now we also have what we call a wage spiral. Okay, and this also causes inflation. This is actually a kind of cost push inflation. Okay, so how does this occur? All right, say employers, say they walk into Tesco or they walk into Aldi or they walk into Sainsbury, and they're like, listen, prices have gone up just a bit, right? And they go to their employer and they say, we need more wages because what you used to pay us before cannot cover our living expenses. Prices have gone up. So they ask for higher wages, okay? Now, say the employers agree and they do give their employees higher wages. What happens, right? This is an increased cost for the employer, right? Okay, so cost of production has increased. Now, this producer, this employer is going to increase the price of the commodity, okay? So to everybody else now, the prices have gone up. So this is cost push inflation, right? And what's going to happen? These employers once again are going to walk into Tesco or Aldi or Sainsbury, right? And then they're going to be like, prices have gone up. And they're going to go once again and ask the employer for more money. And this is a spiral that will keep occurring. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the wage spiral. So how do we measure inflation in the UK? In the UK, inflation is generally measured by the Consumer Prices Index, the CPI, and the Retail Price Index. Lately, we haven't been using the Retail Prices Index. We have focused on the Consumer Prices Index. They both compare the price of a typical basket of goods and services of a household with the price of the same basket the year before. So the RPI, the Retail Prices Index, includes council tax, mortgage interest payments, buildings insurance, house depreciation. Okay, this means that lower or higher mortgage costs would affect the Retail Prices Index, but not the CPI. Okay, now we sort of use the CPI in the UK, okay? Since the general election of May 2010, the incoming Conservative Chancellor George Osborne at the time announced that the CPI was to be more widely adopted, including for certain benefits and pensions, okay? So we use the Consumer Prices Index, and we'll talk about what is in there in a bit. So what is in the CPI, the Consumer Prices Index? You can see it's got all sorts of commonly used items by a general UK household. So they're saying the average UK household will spend some of this at some point, will use their income on some of this at some point. So food and non-alcoholic beverages, alcohol and tobacco, clothing and footwear, housing and household services, furniture, health, transport, communication, recreation, education, restaurants and hotels, miscellaneous goods and services. So the theory simply is that whatever household you live in the UK or whoever you are, you spend your money on these things. So we take an average, a weighted average of all these products, and we compare the prices this year to the prices the year before. So how do we measure inflation? Say inflation in the second period, so inflation in year two. Say inflation in 2017 would be, we would find the CPI for this period, so 2017 minus the CPI for 2016 divided by the CPI for 2016 times 100. Okay, so inflation in year two would be the CPI in year two minus the CPI in year one divided by a CPI in year one times 100. Okay, so your inflation rate would be a CPI in the second period minus your CPI in the previous period, all divided by the CPI in the previous period times 100. Okay, so this is simply how you calculate the inflation rate. All right, so for your first class activity for the week, these are your questions. Suppose that the CPI in a country increases from 150 to 153 over a period of a year. What is the annual rate of inflation? Give 3 examples of cost push inflation. And in a period of rapid inflation, what will be the least desirable store of wealth? Okay, so think about these, do these, and this set of questions will constitute your first class activity for the week. Right, the second major concept we'll be talking about this week is unemployment. So what is unemployment? Unemployment is a measure of the number of jobless people who want to work, are available to work, and are actively seeking employment. Now, note those 3 conditions. They want to work, they are available to work, and are actively seeking employment. Not that they're not looking for work, not that they're not seeking for employment. They can actually work, they're showing up, and they are seeking employment. Very, very important. They're not just staying at home, not looking for work, they are actually seeking employment. So how do we measure unemployment? The first one is the claimant count. So the number of individuals actually claiming unemployment related benefits at any moment. The reason for this is before you can qualify to claim unemployment related benefits, you should be unemployed. So that's the first method. Second method is based on interviews to find out people who want to work but are unemployed. Okay, now this is the official way of measuring unemployment in the UK. So we find out those who want to work but are not actually in employment. Okay, this is the method right now in the UK. You can argue for and against it, but literally we're looking for those who are trying to get jobs. So what are the causes of unemployment? Your first cause of unemployment is your cyclical unemployment. Okay, so this relates to cyclical trends in growth and production that occur within the business circle. Remember what we said about the business circle? You have your recession, your depression, your recovery, and your boom. So in periods of recession and depression, there would be high unemployment. Okay, so your business circle is slowing down. Your recession, depression, you hit rock bottom. So unemployment is progressing in those 2 states. And then between your recovery and your boom, your unemployment should be reducing because in your recovery, investment is picking up, consumer confidence is going up, businesses are investing, so they'll be employing more people. Also with your boom, businesses are really doing well, GDP growth is very high. All right, so unemployment would be low. All right, so that relates to your cyclical unemployment. It has to do with the business circle. So once you hear business circle, you know cyclical. Business cycle, cyclical, okay? Business cycle, cyclical unemployment. Structural unemployment. This results from industrial reorganization, typically due to technological change rather than fluctuations in demand and supply. Okay, so if a industry becomes uncompetitive, right? So maybe they have to restructure, right? You're talking structural unemployment, technology taking over people's jobs. This is a huge issue now in today's society. This is structural unemployment. So your ATM machines, your dispensers at the shop, okay, taking over jobs of your tellers, and then robots in production line taking over jobs of people. All these are structural unemployment. Then you have your seasonal unemployment. These are caused when people are unemployed at certain times of the year because they work in industries where they are not needed all year round. Think about the hospitality industry, for instance. Okay, over summer they need to hire lots of people. Maybe when the break is out, they might not need to be open. Okay, so all those people won't be employed during that period. Think about a famine during the harvest season, or maybe during the planting season. You need more hands. Okay, so more people will be hired, and all these falls under seasonal unemployment. Take Santa, for instance. Santa has seasonal unemployment all from January till, around late November. We only need him in December, right? Christmas Day. So there you have it. And then frictional search unemployment. This exists when people are moving from one job to another. Okay, say Obama is leaving the presidency, looking for another job. He has frictional unemployment. So people are not aware of everything that's going on in society, right? We need to link them up to jobs. This is why we need job centers. We need websites. We need places where people can go and look for the kind of jobs, maybe get the skills, or if they have the skills already, apply for those jobs. Okay, so when people are moving from one job to another, searching, we call that search frictional unemployment. And then you have your classical real wage unemployment. This occurs when wages are kept above the clearing wage rate. So it leads to a surplus of labor supply. Okay, let's just try and show that over here. Say we have wages as our price, and we have labor hours or whatever, or units, right? So what's going to happen when wages are high? Just typical demand and supply, right? People want to supply more labor. Okay, but how about the demand for labor? It's like that, right? Employers will want to hire more people when wages are lower, right? When wages are high, the demand will be lower. So here we're at equilibrium. Okay, and let's say for some reason wages are kept above this equilibrium, above this market clearing rate. What will happen? Say this was our equilibrium here, right? And then wages are now kept here for some reason. So what's going to happen is you have a low demand, but you have an excess supply. Okay, so you have an excess supply of labor. Okay, what's happening here is that individuals want to supply labor at this rate, but demand producers don't want to pay this amount of money, so they want this amount at that rate. So you have an excess supply, and that is your classical real wage unemployment. Okay, so how do we practically measure unemployment? The unemployment rate is simply the number of unemployed persons divided by the labor force. Okay, now your labor force includes both employed persons and unemployed persons. We're talking about the total labor force. Okay, this is usually individuals, adults, okay, between the ages of maybe 16 to 65. So working adults, so those not yet ready for retirement, and those that can be legally employed in your country's constitution. Okay, so that includes the labor force. All those who are employed or unemployed are counted in the labor force. So your number of unemployed persons divided by a labor force would give you your unemployment rate. Very important. number of unemployed persons over labor force. Right. So the second class activity for the week is this. If there are 3 million people unemployed and 24 million people employed, what will be the rate of unemployment? Okay, remember what we said? The unemployment rate is the number of unemployed persons divided by the labor force. The labor force includes unemployed and employed persons. So, once again, if there are 3 million people unemployed and 24 million people employed, what will be the rate of unemployment? This is your second class activity. Okay, so let's bring it all together. Why have we linked these two concepts together? Because of the Phillips curve. So why have we linked unemployment and inflation together? So remember, we started talking about inflation and we went on to unemployment. The reason is because of this economist called William Phillips, a British economist. He showed the inverse relationship between the level of unemployment and the rate of inflation, and hence the Phillips curve. The Phillips curve was named after him, named after William Phillips. So it shows the supposed inverse relationship between the level of unemployment and the rate of inflation. So look at what we have here. We have inflation, and then we have unemployment. Okay. So when inflation is high, unemployment is low. Okay. And when inflation is low, conversely, you can see unemployment is high, right? Okay. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the Phillips curve. That's what the Phillips curve shows. Now, does this always happen? Well, with some data, yes. Okay. Now, some economists will argue that this doesn't always happen, but we have seen it a lot. So, and that is the reason for the Phillips curve. All right, ladies and gentlemen, that's all, folks. Been good having you. Have a fantastic week. Be good to yourselves. Be good to each other. And don't forget your class activity. Okay, these are your class activities. Once again, class activity 1, class activity 2. See you later. Have a fantastic week. Bye.